Good evening, everyone. I am calling our special board meeting to order on February 8th, 2022. Mr. Treasurer, please call the roll.
President Adair,
Present.
Ms. Beckerly,
Present.
Mr. Brown, Mr. Cole,
Here.
Dr. Pierce, Vice President Reyes,
Here.
and Ms. Vera.
And Dr. Pierce and Board Member Brown are joining us via Zoom, so they are virtually participating.
And the 4 members here constitute a quorum.
Yes, we have a quorum. On tonight's agenda, we are going to be working with Dr. Blue on looking at our equity-focused vision of governance for the district. And that is all that is on our agenda. So is there a motion to approve our agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Any additions or discussion? Seeing none, no objection, the agenda is now adopted. Before I turn it over to Dr. Blue, I just want to remind everyone that we are in our 5th annual relationship week, and every day this week has a different theme. Today's theme is one act of kindness, and I know school's over, but you have until 11:59 tonight. So do your one act of kindness. We want every member of our district to commit to performing at least one random act of kindness, anything from a small compliment given to a stranger, sharing a seat on the bus, to offering an inspiring gesture that could be life-changing. Imagine if everyone in Columbus City's schools took part, generating more than 60,000 total acts of kindness in just one day. So you still have some time. Tomorrow, just as a preview, it's Forgiveness Day. And being able to apologize is a sign of humility and courage. Be brave and offer an apology for something you may have done unintentionally that offended another person, or find an opportunity to forgive someone else. You can repair broken relationships by removing grudges. Ask the simple question, what can I do to make this right? So let's work on forgiveness tomorrow, and you still have some time for your one act of kindness today. Board Member Cole, you wanted to make a quick announcement.
Thank you, Madam President. I just wanted to just have a quick moment of silence, if we could, for the recent and tragic passing of Mr. Sean Martin. Mr. Martin was one of our safety and security staff. He worked between 2 buildings, being Walnut Ridge and Columbus Downtown High School. It's just a moment for us to acknowledge our fallen brethren and staff here in our district, but more importantly, an opportunity to honor the lives of our men and women who serve us as safety and security, as teachers, as bus drivers, as any number of things that contribute to the well-being of our students and the protection of our students and staff. Just a moment of silence, please. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Board Member Cole. We'll turn it over to you, Dr. Blue.
All right. Thank you, President Adair, Vice President Reyes, members of the board, Dr. Dixon. It's my pleasure to be here this evening for our 3rd work session. And we just have a couple things on the agenda for today, and I'm hoping for some robust conversation, but then also maybe some action steps at the end of the meeting so that we can kind of move some other work forward. So I will go ahead and jump in. It works. So we just, you just never know with technology sometimes. So today, the first thing I want to do is talk to you a little bit about the department, because even though there's been a lot of work that's been going on, you all may not have always heard about a lot of it and the community as well. And so I want to just run through a few things with you in terms of the work that we've been doing over the past several months and year, and then also really dig into the equity policy, and kind of see how far we can get in terms of finalizing some of those pieces of really what does a effective equity policy look like for us here in Columbus City. So just some background about the department. It started out as a department of 1, which you all know. I was hired in 2020 during the pandemic, and so I really spent a lot of that first year getting a sense of our systems, our policies, kind of the way that we work, just to get a sense of what are some of the barriers that people see that we can address in terms of doing equity work, both as it pertains specifically to students, but also as it pertains to our employee experience. And so being able to see all of those pieces. So in 21, in the summer, I brought on a couple of folks. We're kind of building out the team, but also the social emotional learning work also came under my department. So then it wasn't just equity, but also starting to look at how do we really think about social emotional health of students and really adults too, but for us focusing on students, how does that connect to equity work? And so really building out that idea of the connection between the two. And this summer also as part of, so that came under during my first year, but this summer we expanded the idea because, as you know, we're looking at attendance and some other things, and so really trying to approach the work from a whole child perspective instead of just looking at SEL or just looking at attendance or just looking at mental health supports, but seeing how does all of that connect. And so we hired an executive director, which obviously you know as Mrs. Ward, to be the executive director of whole child supports, and so really kind of overseeing and bringing together that integration of those pieces. So our attendance office, it was new this year, and then, you know, of course, our social emotional supports were kind of brought in together with those pieces. So the way that we're structured, even though we're the Department of Equity, we're kind of split into two, and I talked about the whole child piece, but then the equity sort of division, if you will, still a small shop for right now, and I wrote down probably 3 or 4 different times what Stan said at the board meeting last week. Got to ask for what you want. Got to ask for what you want. I said, okay, so sir, when we come back and start asking for what we want, I'm gonna say, hey, this is what you said. So right now we're starting out with a director and a supervisor, and just as a small team, we are doing some work together to look at equity from a systems standpoint, and that's really important in terms of not just seeing equity as the outcomes of, for example, graduation or mentoring programs or things like that, but really what are the systems, what are the policies, and that's kind of where the board conversation comes into play, is how do we really mitigate some of those things from the systems level, from the front, so that we don't have to then on the back end try to put Band-Aids on larger, more complex problems. So this is our team. Tanya McClanahan, who's our equity director, sitting beside me, and then our equity supervisor, Dr. Rhonda Peoples. So just to kind of go through a few of the things that we have been working on so far throughout the school year, and one of the things I'll mention before I jump into the partnerships is that one of the things that Dr. Peoples is working on is finalizing the administrative guidelines for the student gender nonconforming policy that you all approved last year. So she's been working very collaboratively with academic services, operations, HR, various departments, technology, to really put together some strong guidelines around that policy. And we'll be doing some upcoming training soon to make sure that folks know exactly what the policy is about, how do we really support our LGBT QIA plus students, and what what are some of the supports that we need to have in place, or the knowledge that we need to have in order to better support our students in that way. And so that's one of the bigger projects that she's working on, so that we can make sure that we have that guidance for folks, because I have definitely noticed that our adults want to support our students in that way, but they just are not sure what to do, and so we're working on that. So one of the things that when I first came in, as I mentioned, as a department of one, brought in Hanover Research to help with some of the support and kind of building capacity for me as a one-person shop, as we were getting some things kind of outlined. And so one of the bigger things that there were sort of three areas really that they did for us. And so the first one being collecting data on various aspects, primarily academic, but not all, but looking at both behavior and academics to see what are some of the areas that we may want to look at when it comes to equity. And so one of the things that we talked about a lot at the beginning, if you recall, was an equity audit. And so just the idea really of an audit being, let's dig into our data to see what do we have, what do we need, where are the gaps. So they kind of got some of that work started for us, and there's still more that we want to do in terms of that, and which I'll talk about soon. But one of the things that we want to be able to get to, depending on how things are in terms of the pandemic, is student focus groups, and we kind of came in at the end of some of the portrait of a graduate work, and I know that folks were maybe focus grouped out and kind of zoomed out, but we do want to hear from our communities. So that is something that's still on the list in terms of ways to triangulate some of the data that we're seeing. But they are working on kind of a final report for us around that, and so we'll be able to share that information soon. But the other piece was a survey that they did for us, which we just got back a few weeks ago, earlier so I guess it was in January, with some results around our very first equity survey, which we had a fairly decent response considering how response rates can be sometimes. But we want to see about how to really leverage that into kind of a larger data collection process in terms of really being able to hear from folks around what they care about when it comes to equity, or what their concerns are or what their needs are. So they did that data analysis for us. They also did some other projects around teacher quality, so just kind of working with HR and other departments around what are some of the things that we want to know more about that we don't have time or capacity to collect data on, that they can help us be able to find evidence-based practices on. So that's the work that they have done with us over the last couple of years. This particular partnership, I just have been so in love with, because it's been so nice to be able to connect with other districts around around Central Ohio. We are part of a small cohort called Leading Antiracist Change through Ohio State, and it's a collaboration between the College of Education and the College of Business to really think about what are some of the ways that they can support DEI leaders who are in K-12, because a lot of the work looks at higher ed, but not necessarily what does this look like for K-12. So it's still a fairly new idea for K-12. So they provide support, professional development, coaching. We've been really approaching equity from a learning science standpoint, and so to the point I made earlier around really wanting to think about equity from a systems lens, that's what the learning science piece does. And so it really asks kind of what are the problems that you're trying to solve, what are the root cause analysis of those things. And so we're not just creating strategies, but we're actually looking at what might be some of the reasons that we are having some of the problems, and knowing that we obviously can't control everything. Of the things that we can control, what are the things that we can do to impact some of the problems that that the problems of practice that we may see in our work, and approaching that not just from a standpoint of what happens in school buildings, but also what happens in terms of the way we make decisions in our departments, so that every department is beginning to think a little bit differently about equity. So that's the way that we are approaching our work in terms of looking at equity. So that started this past summer, and it'll culminate this coming up summer with we have met quarterly and they're going to be doing a site visit to kind of help us work through some things, and then we'll meet again as a larger group this summer. So any questions so far? I feel like I'm talking a lot. I just want to make sure this. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry.
Former Cole.
Thank you. What were the barriers to success, if you will? You mentioned that, you know, there was fair success with the survey. What do you think were those barriers to, you know, making it, you know, something optimal in terms of identifying a random sample and then getting the responses you were looking for in that random sample?
In terms of the Hanover survey,
Mm-hmm.
so I guess what I meant was we really wanted to see high participation. So it wasn't about a random survey sort of thing. It was more around really wanting to hear from as many people as possible.
So
Yeah.
let me move to rephrase, making your random survey larger,
Right.
increasing participation. What do you think was the barrier to that?
Oh, I see. So when it comes to surveys, you know, what they would tell us is, both working with them and working with Panorama on other surveys, is that they don't really they don't expect always a high participation rate. So people get fatigued, as I mentioned, or in the case of a survey like an equity survey, you're asking people to say things that might make them uncomfortable, to be that vulnerable in a survey, to say how they feel about things related to equity. And so that can also be a potential barrier. We try to make sure to say as much as possible that it was anonymous, but the culture sometimes being what it is, people are not as trusting, and so they don't always know, if I say this, is there going to be a repercussion? So I think for us, when I think about a barrier, we'll just be moving at the speed of trust, if you will. So as we show that we really do want to know, and that we really do want to utilize what we learn, and let people know what we did with the information that they gave us, then we expect for that to grow just organically.
Interesting. In a random survey, folks felt vulnerable or distrustful of sharing information that was asked. I mean, do you think there might have been a language issue, that this might have been, I don't know, too socially scientific in language? Do you think that might have been a barrier too, that folks are hearing all of these, you know, high level, you know, even a simple term as we would see it as equity is a socially scientific term that, you know, has a nuanced, let alone complex definition.
Absolutely.
It's very nuanced.
So
Do you think that was an issue, just understanding what they're being asked?
So the interesting thing about the survey is that it was very simply written. Do you think it's important for students to interact with people who are different from them? So it wasn't in that kind of, you know, education, jargony sort of language at all.
Okay.
Yeah, everything was very simply stated for that reason, just to kind of get a sense of, you know, how do you feel about people who are different than you are? Is this important? You know, that sort of thing, more so than the way that we talk about it, you know, outside of that.
Okay, and then the last thing is, what were the modalities of it? Was this a phone call? Was this go to your Infinite campus and fill this out? What was it?
So we did it internally for this first one. We did it with our CCS employees only. So the next time that we do this survey, it'll be with families and students. But we did this first survey with just our CCS employees. So it was a link that went to email, and there were, let's see, we also offered the option of a paper copy for those who wanted it. We didn't get responses of people who wanted it, but we had it available in several languages, paper, as well as the link.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Member Beckerly.
Just have a quick question. I love the idea of realizing that, you know, you're going to get better response. The speed of trust, was that the language?
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a Stephen Covey book.
Did, love him. Did you get, does Hanover, I assume because we rely on them for to give it the scientific stamp of approval, did they feel like they got enough so that it's a meaningful survey, or was it not even, did it meet certain thresholds that allowed them to draw conclusions, I guess?
Well, interestingly, they told us that they were very impressed with how
good.
much response they got, that we did get on the survey. So
You just want more.
yes, we just want more. And then also, you know, really the way we want to use it is not to say, you know, X% said this. I mean, it's not about the results in this case. It's giving people, getting them used to being able to give us feedback in this way is really what the purpose was for this first one. So,
Thanks. Makes sense.
absolutely. You want to add? Please do.
President Adair, just to add to that, the first survey was really given to our staff to be able to say, your voices matter. Like, we want to hear from you, right? So the campaign kind of and the messaging around that was like, all voices matter. We want to hear from everyone who is working in the district to be able to give us information back about where you see that we can improve. And so just to kind of add to what Dr. Blue said, I believe that with Hanover's response back to us, that they were, you know, very pleased with the first 48 hours in terms of the responses that we received. And as we gave reminders that the window was closing, you could see the response rates going up. I think that there's great confidence that as we move forward with continuing to ask our staff to give us feedback, that we'll see even higher response rates.
Terrific. Thank you.
Okay, so then we'll move on to our next partnership, which is around our Guardrail 3 work. So you'll be happy to see this, and this is work that we're collaborating between Stan's office, Human Resources, and my office to dig some more into really learning more about how to bring about resource equity. So we were approached by the National Equity Project and Education Resource Strategies. They have this partnership called the Equity Alliance or Equity Resource Alliance, and we are a part of that. Part of a cohort of districts that they're providing technical assistance to, and it's going to be a two-year cohort, and throughout this 2 years we've already kind of given them some data that for them to analyze, that we'll be sharing back with the board. But really their role is helping me, for example, to work closer with HR and with our finance team to think about what counts, what do we mean when we say resources, and how do we both acquire and distribute those resources more effectively. So I kind of framed it in terms of time, talent, and treasure, because it's about the financial resources, but it's also about human resources, and it's also about the resource of time in terms of, you know, in the classroom or in school buildings, how do we use teacher time. So it's been actually quite different than maybe we first thought about that guardrail when it came to resources, but it's a lot more comprehensive, because it's not just about, you know, how are we spending money, if you will, but it's also about how we're utilizing our people, which does end up also kind of being a financial, you know, resource. So I think that we're going to get a lot of really helpful information about how to really restructure things in a way that that is kind of more than just about formulas and things, but really about what's the mindset change in terms of how we think about resources. So there'll be more information to come about that. We've just had a couple of meetings, but they also have individualized coaching, and so we'll be meeting with them. They'll be meeting with our finance team and HR team in the in the weeks coming up to kind of go through some of the analysis of the data that they've collected to kind of give us more information. So they've worked with LA Unified, which is much bigger than us, and so that gives me hope that they can help us get there because they have helped other districts to get there. So I'm really looking forward to kind of what that looks like for us.
Before we move on, I have a quick question, Jen.
Good.
Okay, this is something that, and this may be too soon to answer it, but when I think of equitable budgeting, and we got to be careful about, understanding what equity means versus equal. Like, just a hypothetical, could it be sort of like, well, if, let's take third grade reading guarantee, or third grade reading scores. This building's, performing at, and this is, maybe 20 percentage point or 10 percentage points below. Does equitable budgeting mean you come up with a formula that says they get more resources in order to bring it up? Is that what equitable budgeting is?
So,
Or is it, should I just wait until you come back and
yes,
know more?
that would be awesome. Thank you so much.
Fair enough.
Always jumping the gun.
I always
I
love
know
it when
my-
Board Member Beckerly answers her own question. She poses a question and says, yeah, maybe I shouldn't. That's fair, we do that.
Yes,
This
so-
is a big project. If
Yeah,
I
no, it's
interject.
exciting.
This is-
It's really exciting.
This will be a major change in how we view
Mindset.
budgeting, and it'll be more expansive in terms of the resources we consider when we talk about budgeting, and it will be, I think, more expansive in the folks all throughout the district that have to be engaged in that process. And it's a little bit daunting because, I've been doing this for over 40 years.
Never done it.
And we've always done it in a way that, quite frankly, was not equitable, and doesn't address equity. And so it's something that I've jotted down several times, that this old dog needs to learn new tricks, so to speak. So it's a big project.
And one thing that my ears perked when I heard is that you're looking at it both from, a stand, where do the dollars go, but you're also looking at it time, talent, and treasure, and in so doing, you're breaking down silos.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
but it becomes much more complex, but that's what we need. So it's really pretty exciting.
And to your point, an interesting thing about that is I don't have the expertise around finance or human resources. I'm just kind of serving as the pivot point to bring it together. And so a lot of the work of our office will be similar to that.
That makes sense, though. That's
So
good.
we'll hear from them. We'll probably invite them, to provide information or to do presentations when
This
we get to
outfit,
that point.
the them being.
The equity resource folks, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so moving on to thinking about our Guardrail 4 work, one of the things that we were able to do, thanks to Dr. Dixon and you all, was to get research interns for some of our departments. So Equity has a team member who's on loan from Ohio State. He is a doc student from Greece. Unfortunately, he has to leave at the end of the school year, but we would love to be able to keep him on because he's really been great. But he's creating the menu of professional development modules that we referenced in Guardrail 4 interim guardrails. So what we have right now, the vision for is, right now there are 12 kind of large areas of topics for our modules. They're broken down into smaller pieces so that you can easily, if you were on a lunch break or on a planning period, you could do a module during that time. So we didn't want them to be too long. We want them to be easily accessible and to have a variety of learning modalities, so there could be something to read, something to watch, something to listen to, any of those sorts of things. And understanding that right now we are in a place where it's going to be obviously voluntary, but we want to work on how do we get to a place where there's a core of modules that everyone onboarding, has to take, or something like that, so those things will continue to come. We also want to think about, can we put this together in a way that someone can get CEUs for it? So just what are the things we can do to make it more attractive to folks? But it would come in at 3 different levels. So if you were just kind of in this emerging sort of beginner place, then the material is at that level. If you're kind of in the middle, or if you're advanced, then you get different things in your module. So they can be customized in different ways to create a customized learning path. So it's really exciting, the idea of it, and we've built all these things out, and so now we just kind of have to test it. So we have several groups that want to potentially volunteer to kind of go through them with us. There's some folks from certified, classified, different departments, so we'll have just kind of a small cadre of folks who just at their own pace and just give us feedback and input on how they experience them, so that we can tweak them before before we start to really use them. We want to make sure that we're as collaborative as possible, so as much input as we can get as we do that.
Madam President, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Do you intend for this paradigm that you develop to be cross-departmental, cross-cutting in terms of employee classification? Is this something that every one of our district employees across the line, and maybe even some of our student leaders across the line, could actually participate in?
Absolutely.
Benefit
It's on
from?
Canvas, and everyone with the CCS email will be able to access them. The only thing that may be a little bit different, there may be a path that's specifically classroom-based, so there'll be some pieces that are specific to culturally responsive teaching or pedagogy, but everything else, and then probably also some kind of what is culturally responsive customer service, if you will, look like, which can be easily given to, that could easily apply to a lot of different of our job classes too. So all of the topics are topics that you could potentially encounter no matter what you do for the district.
Okay. Thank you.
I got something too, Jen.
So she's not even. Is this okay?
Yes,
Okay, 'cause
absolutely.
I just want to make sure you have enough time, or if you're going to cover any of this.
That's true. That's a good point.
I mean, because you want to get us to the policy.
Yes.
So.
Okay, this is quick.
And it's 6 o'clock.
Can board members do this?
Yes.
And if you wanted to somehow use that as board members are doing it too for parallel processing and the value of that,
Absolutely. I love that idea.
take a video of us and I just completed my module.
Yes.
Or if we even did it together after a meeting or something.
Absolutely.
All right, let's put a pin in that.
Okay, absolutely. We'll do that. We'll definitely follow up.
I know I'm not always quick, but that was kind of quick.
Yes. Yeah. So then, so just to kind of tie these things up a little bit, I just want to show you all, kind of what we've been working on. So the last piece is just that, and this may end up being a longer conversation. So I'm just going to ask you to just kind of put a pin in it, if so, and because we will come back to this. But one of the things that we noticed in the responses that and it wasn't really the responses, it was maybe more so the questions that were asked by Hanover, considering that next to the things that we want to learn in terms of the guardrails, we thought that it would be a better idea to pivot to Panorama for the equity survey, because they have much more targeted scales around some of the things that we know that we want to get to around being able to show culturally responsive staff. So these are just 4 of the scales that they have, and we'll be using some of that sense of belonging, diversity, and inclusion to start digging in. And we already have a relationship with Panorama. They already are very good about how they outreach to families and students and our staff. So, and considering the cell surveys already in our department, we're going to pivot that way to just bring those together. And then last but not least, obviously what we really want to kind of get to today is um, the the discussion of the policy. So the idea is if we can get to a place where once that policy is adopted, then what comes out of it in terms of what we would typically call an administrative guideline would be for us an equity framework, a kind of a go forward plan that is kind of already being built into the work that we're doing around the guardrails, as I shared, as well as our strategic priority area 2, equitable opportunities for all, so that we can start bringing some structure to the work so that people can kind of see and understand the fuller vision. So the policy will just kind of provide some backbone for that. And then let's see, and I think I think I've already covered probably all the rest of those aspects. So are we ready to talk about the policy?
Yes.
All right. So the this question about the policy, it's been coming since really before I moved here, or before I started, I should say. So, but when we first started talking about an equity policy, maybe back a year or more ago, we had other things that weren't quite in place yet, and so now I have kind of brought it back around to ask if we can kind of put it back on the table, because now that we've gotten some other things in place in terms of goals, guardrails, strategic priority areas, now is a perfect time to kind of come back to this conversation. So when we think about why we would even develop a policy around equity, I think the other piece is for us as staff and the board to understand what it is what's the purpose that it's going to serve. So the first, of course, is just the confidence that the board provides to both the internal school community, but also the larger community, that you all are committed to this. We know that, and a policy is a way to kind of show that, because policies are obviously things that will live beyond us in a lot of ways, and so just showing that you're willing to put those commitments down on paper in a way that shows, yes, we are committing to this. So that's kind of the first piece, but also it provides helps to provide intentional focus for us, those of us in terms of leadership and staff, that we have to focus on this because that is what the board wants. And this is very much a community of, is there a policy for this? What does the board say? What did Dr. Dixon say? So people want to know that our leadership is committed. So this a policy provides that, but it also impacts the outcomes, the success that we want to have around academic success for students who may be marginalized, social emotional health of our folks. It helps to impact those things because we're looking at equity in various areas that also impact those things. And then finally, it can serve as an anchor, the same way I talked about being a pivot between, finance and HR around resource equity. And equity policy does a similar thing. So it provides an anchor to say, if we're making this decision, what does our policy say about what's important in terms of what we have to accomplish and be accountable for? So it can provide that in terms of not just the way we make decisions as leadership and staff, but also the way that you all make decisions as a board. Because policy is what ends up changing or not changing the direction that we would go as an organization anyway when we think about larger culture. And so being able to have that conversation, even as you're approving policy about something that may not on the surface seem like there's an equity component, it can kind of help bring that together. So I was telling Tanya earlier, I was impressed with myself
If I
because.
could,
Board
yeah,
Member
if
Brown.
I could, I just had, yes, thank you. Just had a question on this, and it may be something you're going to cover later. But isn't it important, especially with this type of policy where few people understand the word equity. And many people get it wrong, or they confuse it with equality or something else. That we use this opportunity of publishing a policy to explain precisely what we mean by that term.
Yes, sir, absolutely. And if you recall, the last um, maybe twice, a couple times we were together, that was the whole conversation: is what does this really mean, right? And it can be tricky in a lot of ways. And so we are definitely going to um, put down a definition that this is what we mean when we say yes. And that's something that we're working on in conjunction with some other departments, getting some feedback from community members, having some focus groups around that, just to make sure that when we say it, to Board Member Cole's point earlier, that it's not a jargony academic definition that people don't understand, but as simply and as easily as we can frame it to where people know what it is and can see themselves as part of it.
And I guess also by contrasting it, comparing it to other terms that it's easily confused with.
Yes, yes. So that'll
Okay.
definitely be part of, as we dig into the draft, that we will consider and bring back to you for further discussion.
Thank you.
Just a very quick add-on to that, and thank you, Madam President. We do have a glossary in our policy piece, in our policy section. So, you know, we worked that out with Neola. So just so you know, that's where I think Board Member Brown definitely would like, and I would too, like to see that housed
Okay.
in our
absolutely.
glossary section on our policy.
Okay, okay. Thank you for that. So when we think about the development of the policy, it does also come down to these three things when we think about what are the components of an equity policy. And so the first being the movement. So what is it that the board is trying to act upon, or the needle that we're trying to move by having this policy? And so that's something that these three areas I want us to kind of, you know, just reflect on a little bit, because I and this is just, you know, my kind of personal offline opinion, is that I don't know that we were necessarily very clear about that at the beginning. And I think now that we've done some other things, portrait of a graduate, I think we're a lot closer to knowing what it is that we want to move, you know, as a district, as a board. The second piece is the measurement in terms of what the policy will do. So how will you as a board know that the policy that you have approved is being implemented with fidelity in the way that it's the spirit of it that you've outlined? So that's the other piece, is being specific in the policy about, not so specific we want to see X number, that sort of thing, but just being clear about how you want to see it measured. And then finally, the monitoring of it, which is, you know, this is the type of policy that you will want to be able to come back to in whatever cadence you decide, to say, hey, how are we moving on this? Some of that is going to automatically come out as we go through more work with the goals and guardrails, but not all of it will. So there may be some other opportunities that you might want to take to say, hey, we need reporting, you know, around the policy at these certain time frames. And so those are the three things that will likely be primary components in terms of what's in the policy. So to get to some of this analysis of where we are with what we have, I looked at 25, 26 other districts. Some were very similar to us in terms of student demographics. Others were larger than us, or were in larger cities than ours, just to get a sense of both in a district our size and ones that are larger, what governs their district in terms of an equity policy. Obviously, I looked at the Ohio 8 and our Council of Greater City Schools districts as well, because those are also peer districts for us in a lot of ways, and then spoke to some of the leaders of some of those districts, And as I mentioned earlier, there's, I've been in either PLC meetings or other meetings with some of those leaders, and have been able to have some of those conversations as well. And so each, district had some version. Most of them had a board approved policy, but also most of those policies were only a year or so old, not terribly old. And so it is and so I would say the idea of equity and the equity work at K-12 is fairly new, but having an equity policy is also new. And so it's also a good time for us to revisit the idea, because it is something that now we're being able to see that this is something that school boards around the country are committing to. So interestingly, I came upon two versions of our policy. One was an actual, and you all may already know this, but there was an actual adopted equity policy, and it was adopted, you can see 97, um, quite a while ago. But in the switch to Neola, that particular policy never carried over for whatever reason. So even though it was something that the board approved at that time, it's not something that currently exists in our policy manual. So in reading through it, it was primarily focused on resource equity, and even in that sense, not resource in the way that we've been talking about it even just tonight. So mainly resource in terms of finance. But some of the references and language were also sort of outdated, which I thought is a good call out to the fact that we want to keep the language as general and macro as possible, so that in another 25 years, folks aren't looking at it saying, oh, this language is very dated. So, so even though it had those, as I guess you could say, cons, there were definitely some aspects to think about in an updated policy, primarily the piece about looking at resource equity. But we also have a draft policy that is much newer, that has been worked on by various folks over the course of the last year or two, that has much more updated language. It has some definitions and things like that, but it also has primarily belief statements, and which we'll talk about here shortly. And to the point about the dated language of the original policy, the language of belief statements may not translate over time, and so that's something that we have to decide: do we want to keep all of that, or some of that, or which pieces of that? And that'll be something to kind of mull over a little bit. But because of that, it reads less like a typical board policy, whereas the original is really based on what can the board do, what is the action, and there may be some opportunity to meld those two ideas together, but kind of building off of what we have right now as the current draft policy. So if you recall, and you may not because this has been a year ago easily, but the last time we were together, and I gave homework, and I appreciate Dr. Pierce appreciating the homework, even though I know not everyone appreciated the homework. But one of the things that I asked is, what are your non-negotiables? So what I did was just kind of took what you all said and asked for you to rank these ideas in terms of how important is this idea in a board policy. So there were 6 of them, and I just ranked them kind of in order of how you all voted on them, and keeping obviously in mind that since then there's been some change, some turnover in the board, but still, more or less these were the largely the order that they were in. So I'm just going to throw this up there just kind of for you to read and just think about them just for a second, and then we'll go over the next 3. But just think about whether those are still ideas that you want to be sure to include, with that, the one at the top being the most important thing as a group that you all said.
I would reorder them now.
You said you would reorder them? Okay. So I guess my question would be, we can talk about the reordering now, or I can send something out and you can kind of reorder without it being a public thing.
I don't know what the best process is for that. I mean, obviously, Board Member Rivera, who's not able to participate tonight, she didn't participate.
You didn't participate,
in this,
right?
and now we have our, we've gone through more strategic planning and have our goals and guardrails where equity is, something that we're looking at. So it may be better to have the board kind of reflect on it and do a little more homework, instead. I mean, because we're missing, and I love that they're here virtually, but it'd be great to all be in the same space
Right.
as well, because I know it's hard to participate that way.
Right. Good point.
Can I have a quick question about?
Hold on, Board Member Cole had his hand up first.
Just as a recommendation in terms of the reordering piece, because I agree with President Adair, but I do think that our definition of equity must be inclusive, that aspect of it, and more particularly what Board Member Brown and even myself alluded to, would be the first priority, that we establish a sound definition and understandable or comprehensive definition of what equity is.
Right.
I think that would be priority one.
Okay.
And then, like she said, I think it makes sense to kind of mull over everything else.
Absolutely. Okay. So then,
Board Member Beckerly.
So I just have a question. So these are in terms of priority,
they are listed in terms of how you all originally voted for them, yes.
and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 7, right?
There's 7, yeah.
Okay. And some of them we may decide we don't like at all. I mean, I'm not saying that. I just want to understand. I'm not voting on anything one way or another. I just want to understand what we're asking to do.
In terms of what I'm asking you to do right now?
Well, what we're deciding to do.
I think it's about, she's asking us if this order that we came up with more than a year ago is still applicable to where we sit right now. And I think we all need to take a moment and think about that.
All right. Got it. And so these are prioritized the way they are right now.
Send us the thing.
Currently, right, but we'll definitely reshuffle them and we'll send that back out. Because the other aspect is there's always an option to add. If there's something that isn't here anymore, then we can, or something that isn't here, I mean, you can always add that in.
Got it.
Okay.
Thanks.
So then we'll skip past this, the second set as well. So one of the things we'll come back around to that piece. So the other piece of the newer draft is, as I said, it had a set of belief statements. So those are kind of the answers the question of what do you believe as a board about equity, and so I guess I would ask, how much do you want the policy to state the things that you believe versus the things that you will do, or what would be an action? So we can go through, you can just kind of read through the belief statements, but I really want to hear your input on, do you see an equity policy being, we want to do and see an action, or is it primarily, this is what we believe about equity, about kids, about, kind of whatever those aspects are. I'm not sure who had input on what in terms of the original statements, so that's why I'm just kind of asking it in a broad way.
Board President Adair.
Go ahead, Dr. Pierce.
Speak to this. Thank you so much. So Dr. Blue and team, thank you so much for this. I think it's important to note that the entire policy governance or policy committee had input on this, and we approached it as a belief statement in what our board understood to be important values.
Oh, Dr. Pierce, I think we lost you.
Well, she's correct. She's correct. When we started this discussion, even longer than a year ago.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, we got you.
Go ahead, Doc.
So it was really about those belief statements. We were looking to you and your expertise to then come in with those administrative guidelines to really give our board the direction for how we could begin to act out those statements.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Pearson. I believe that
Mhm.
Board Member Brown had his hand up as well. That when I looked up there.
I did briefly, and I just wanted to say that I agree with Tina, and I agree that both things need to be covered in our
Absolutely.
policy. We should have statement of beliefs, and yes, I think they do need some work um, uh, to make sure that they're consistent with what the current board believes, and to make sure that they're the kinds of beliefs that we can hope, I guess, will last for the long term. Secondly, we do need to also state the actions that we want taken, whether that's by us as the board itself or various administrators and people that work for the system or do business with the system will take action or refrain from taking action about. And I think it is important that we do both.
Thank you, Board Member Brown. Board Member Beckerly.
I'm gonna play devil's advocate here, I guess, in the sense that I think that we should be really clear on how we define equity, and that should be absolutely, attended to until we really get it right and it's, what we really want it to say. And then I think we should have almost like a general statement that it's the board's policy that equity will be taken in consideration in every decision we make, and then go into the action part. I don't think that we should have the belief statements, because I think I'm fearful, and I think this is the lawyer in me. I'm fearful the more we put in about that kind of stuff, the more it will almost dilute what we're trying to accomplish, because or it almost like send people down rabbit holes. Well, everybody can learn. Well, everybody can do this, and I think that clarity about the action, what we expect, is the most important thing. Defining what needs to be defined in order to have that clarity, and then that should be how it's structured. Now, sorry, Dr. Blue, because that's completely counter to what everyone said before, but I guess I should weigh in.
Board Member Cole.
I actually don't think it's counter at all. I don't think it's counter at all. I think it's in direct alignment with what we're all saying. A is that we want a clear, comprehensive, sound definition of what equity is. B, a belief statement that says just what you said. It asserts what we value. You could call it a value statement, a belief statement, whatever you want to call it. At the end of the day, it's exactly what you're arguing. It's a statement of premise of where we are on this and how we expect it to be utilized. And then finally, what its intended impact is to be in terms of required action. How do we intend to act upon this? The board shall, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So we're saying the same thing.
Can I speak? Mm-hmm. I almost think that some of these belief statements are really going to be translated into actions. Like, the board policy, if we believe that all students will learn, our equity policy says we must structure our instructional practices such that all students shall learn. So I'm wondering almost if some of these belief statements get repurposed as what the action is. Mm-hmm. And that would be a more effective use of those statements than in the belief section.
I like that, and I like that because I think it aligns to the work we're doing around the strategic priorities and portrait. It provides concrete things that we're all working towards. So I do like that example. I think, again, we're just in a different spot than we were when we were doing this, right? And so I think back when we did this, you know, I think having these sort of more general belief statements was appropriate because we hadn't done this work. And so I do think we can come back in and refine it, just as my board colleagues are kind of putting together here, and kind of have more action-oriented things and things that certain people are responsible for, right? So responsibility type of statements, things that we as a board can monitor. I think that is important. So, you know, and definitely definitions and all of that has to be in there or somewhere else that's in the policy, so that we're all speaking the same language, because that's really critical. So, you know, I don't know until we start drafting how much or what weight goes on what thing, I suppose. But I also want to make sure the policy, because I mean, in just a year, think how fast we've moved. So I want to make sure in another year, whatever we write still gives us the flexibility, gives staff enough guidance, and, you know, is still continuing to align with the work that we're doing around goals and guardrails, because, you know, we're still learning there. And so we need flexibility in the policy to be able to adapt and grow in that space too. Vice President Rice,
President Adair, if I might.
Dr. Pierce?
Yeah, so I think that, again, I agree with everything that you and Board Member Coe have indicated. Again, the policy committee had very rich dialogue on this policy and the specific concepts and the belief statements that we put in there. One could literally take those first 5 statements, educational equity, racial equity, and put those in the glossary of definitions. And then when we come down to how we're going to achieve it, again, those can be used to inform the actions that we lay out. So again, I agree with you 100% and want to reiterate that as the committee did this work, again, this work was conducted in 2020. So 2 years later, we're now coming back to this policy and saying, let's move forward with it. When the committee initially was doing this work, we were at that point where we were establishing a foundation to build a really sound policy that would last for several years within our district.
You know, and a perfect example of like what I think what we didn't really fully understand 2 years ago when looking at this is, you know, what has happened through the pandemic. And you mentioned neurodiversity, right? The impact of trauma on the formation of the brain. We're going to be dealing with that for a long time. And so how do our students who've now been affected by this trauma, what kind of things are they going to need in order to get to the benchmark? You know, it's something we don't know. Right? And so that actually may be an area of equity, and, you know, you have now SEL under you and the whole child. I mean, that we have to have that flexibility to kind of learn and grow in that space. And in reality, that might end up being a bigger area of diversity than ones we thought in the past. So we need to be able to shift kind of focus. And so kind of thinking about diversity in ways that maybe, you know, like I said, we didn't really have, we knew, but we didn't know, right? That impact sitting here today.
And President Adair, if I may, I would say that we had a number of different identities, backgrounds of our students that we wanted to bring into account. I know Emily White spoke of the neurological diversity. And it was hard for us to think about what were those most essential and salient identities and characteristics that were impacting the learning of our students. And so I again agree with you that given where we are right now, some of those identities have come to the top and become more essential and more salient in their impact on our student learning.
Well, that's a perfect example that she gives right there anyway about the concept of equity. So for every student, the identity that they need help with will be different. Mm-hmm. Right. So we have to have a policy and measurements and the way to look at it in a way that is to each child, right?
Which means that it can't be too prescriptive because it will miss that.
Yes, but generally stated in a way that incorporates And I love how this even aligns to our current mission statement.
Mm-hmm.
We don't say every, we say each.
Right.
And I think that there's a very clear delineation between what is every and what is each. So I love the fact that there's this look from any number of different perspectives on how we want equity encapsulated in a designation of a kid.
Right.
Yeah.
That's something.
And
Okay.
so the another piece of that is to think about, to Dr. Pierce's point a bit, how much of how we define it is not necessarily how we define it, but how much of what we prioritize in terms of identity is specifically listed in the policy versus in, maybe whatever the guidelines would look like, the framework, equity plan, that sort of thing, which may change every 3 to 5, 10 years because of the very things that we're talking about. But the policy itself still holds as is.
Absolutely.
Board Member Beckerly?
You know, thinking about how we're teasing out the neurodiversity thing, that kind of gets you to every child has to get what they need. And if that finds its way into the definition somehow,
Well, that is,
that should be the definition.
that is the definition.
Right.
I just picked that out because it was a diversity that, I know was discussed, but may not have, we might not have prioritized it because I think we were prioritizing others. And I guess what I was saying is what Dr. Blue just said. We shouldn't prioritize because it is each child, and each child
True.
needs a separate prioritization, right? Because it's them. But to Dr. Blue's point, there could be things that we see, obviously, through data and trends and disparity that she and we need flexibility on to be able to address certain points in time. So if we see disparity is huge in a certain population, that we have that ability to go in and kind of look at this macro level of groups and look at it in that way as well, and also drill down to each child.
Right.
So,
Vice President Rose, back to board member.
Oh.
so like, I'm trying to listen here, and also, so like when I look up Baltimore City schools, they talk about educational equity. Their definition here says an educational system that ensures that every student has access to the opportunities, resources, and educational rigor they need throughout their educational career to maximize academic success and social emotional well-being, and views each student's individual characteristics as valuable. These characteristics include but are not limited to. Because one of the so we've looked at the equity policy very often, and it's gonna change as we change. So I guess where I'm coming from is like there is a lot of equity work that I've seen going to National School Boards Association. I'm looking at Baltimore right now. I pulled up Philadelphia. We met the folks from Boston. My question is, it sounds like this should be like a working session, and maybe I'm not understanding because I'm trying to figure out where we're going with your presentation. I'm sorry, Dr. Blue. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of feedback, and I feel like we're supposed to be sitting here doing stickies and helping. I don't know if we're helping or not helping. I don't know if we're reinventing work.
We're not, to be quite honest
No.
with you, to answer that question directly. Because
So Michael, I wasn't
Hold
done.
on, hold on
I'm
a
sorry,
second.
my apologies. My apologies.
And then actually,
could
the
answer
order is
that question.
Beckerly, then board member Cole.
Yeah, so I just don't, I'm trying to figure out like what you need from, or maybe, I know we haven't let you finish, but, there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of stuff, and I feel like as many equity policies that I've seen since I've been here, which is a little while, this work exists, but we need to tailor it to us. So I'm assuming this is an introduction of where we're at, and then you're going to have next steps to say this work is going to continue within your department with the help of feedback from us. I'm just trying to figure out where we're at as it is 6:42 right now.
Well,
And I
to be fair, you just talked for like 4 minutes, so.
But that's the only time I've talked all evening.
I know, but you're
Respectfully
saying, you're asking her, when is she gonna be?
No, I'm not asking her when
and
she's
you-
gonna be done. I'm asking her, are we being effective? I just feel like we're stopping you.
You're not.
And, okay.
Board Member Beckley, then Board Member Cole.
I think, I mean, I think maybe the purpose of this meeting is to give you some feedback about where we are in terms of this policy or thoughts about it.
Right, the work of the policy is with the committee, not the board, so that it's a work session in the sense of figuring out what the appetite is with the current policy, but the work that is gonna happen with the committee that already exists,
And so
which
tossing
I'm a
out,
part of,
so a few thoughts that I guess I'd like to toss out is, and I'm just looking at one of these excerpts here about the district must disrupt and dismantle inequities in every area of our work is one of your excerpts. But it made me think of something, and I think President Dare often talks about needing to disrupt and be disruptors.
They blow it up.
Blow it up. I've heard her say blow it up a few times. And it's the every area of our work thing, which kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier about breaking down the silos so that you're working. And this is, I'm just tossing this out because I happen to be married to a policy geek in the hospital setting. And at some point, I guess, in order to make sure that every decision aligned with what was best for the patient, the caregiver, I can't remember what the third one was, they sort of required every decision to have an impact statement. Like, what is, how is this decision, right? So if you're in the custodial ward and you decide to do something differently about how you sweep the floors, how is that decision going to impact the caregivers, the patient, and their families? Maybe it was that three. But whatever it would be, like, it's almost like we need to define equity, and I think, the including but not limited to was a good point that Board Member or Vice President Reyes pointed out. It's a mindset, really, that I think we need this policy to do, to say, we're that serious about equity that we need you to defend, you principal, you teacher, you custodian, you budgeter, to defend every to look through this lens as it's defined in our policy with everything you do. And, it sounds very burdensome to say you have to do an impact statement for every sentence, but I think something akin to that maybe is worth thinking about.
That would necessarily be something that would be in a policy, but in the guidelines.
I guess the policy would probably say it's the policy of the board that we look through an equity lens on every decision we make. And then your guidelines would say, if you're custodial services, you do this. If you're transportation.
It wouldn't necessarily,
it may
the
not.
idea, yes.
Yeah, so it's hard to dictate down equity, you guys.
Right.
So equity and this kind of work, DEI work, has to be embedded in the culture of the people doing the job. So Dr. Blue's job is that, really. Everyone, like Stan is a great example. He gets now, oh my gosh, I actually have to do some equity work. So, and how does that come into play in the everyday business of the treasurer's office? That's how you know it's successful, right? So you can't really, it won't work that way. People will not do it. They will not adjust. They will not accept it. There will not be buy-in. It has to be more organically put in, and they have to understand the why. Why is this important? And that's our job. That's part of our job, is to demonstrate that why. But you can't really dictate it down that way. It just doesn't work.
Right. But
I think
just
that,
like the
yeah, and then Dr. Pierce, do you have your hand up too, or did you just not put it down?
Oh.
I do have my hand
Okay,
up.
so
I just put it up.
Remember Brown and Dr. Pierce. I'm sorry, did I skip you, Dr. I'm sorry. Pause up a virtual space. I forgot Board Member Cole, and then we'll come back to Board Member Brown and Dr. Pierce.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to very quickly kind of inform that about 60% of the work has been done. We took from myriad districts throughout the country. We looked at Baltimore, we looked at Portland, we looked at several different districts throughout the country and created a framework by which we wanted to personalize this or customize this to Columbus City Schools.
I do understand that. I looked at 25 districts also, as I mentioned. So really all I'm doing is making sure that where it is now is still where we want it to be.
No, to your credit, big up, thumbs up, right? To clarification to my colleague, that's whose question I'm answering.
Oh, I'm okay.
Yeah. So we started a lot of this already by putting that type of structural framework in place with language to accompany in that kind of format too, Ramona, Board Member Reyes. So I just wanted to make sure folks, at least here, who might not have seen it, understands what we've done thus far. Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Okay, Board Member Brown and then Dr. Pierce.
Thank you. I appreciate the questions that Ramona raised and then Carol echoed about the process and where are we? What are we doing here now this evening? Because we are running through time and I'm not sure if we're accomplishing things or not. What I did hear that I liked is that Dr. Blue said that whatever she gathers from this meeting, and please correct me if I've got it wrong, but this is a sound out session to inform us of where we are and what's going to continue, but that work is going to continue in the committee. It's not the board that is going to be writing this and working with language until sometime later when it's recommended to the board. One of my questions is, Dr. Blue, when you say the committee that is going to be working this, what committee specifically are you referring to? Is this
your committee?
a committee that you're working, or is this the Policy and Governance Committee?
So interestingly, you probably should see me more at the Policy and Governance Committee, but I have another meeting always at that same time, but I am supposed to be there with you. So my hope is that once we get this input, that we'll come back to the Policy and Governance Committee to have a discussion about what revisions we might need to do.
Okay, and then at some point this will emerge from Policy and Governance with a recommendation to the board.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Okay, just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Dr. Pierce.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Blue, my question is it possible to begin to lay out what some potential administrative guidelines would be given the framework of this policy, the work that we've done around our goals and guardrails? I want to reiterate to my colleagues again that the Policy Governance Committee spent a lot of time thinking through this policy, talking about this policy, and we handed it over to administration with, you know, the encouragement, with the enthusiasm and the passion and the directive to say, hey, come back with those administrative guidelines that align with us ensuring that students are learning, that we're achieving in the district. And so I guess right now in this meeting, I would echo the sentiments of Vice President Reyes and saying, I'm not sure where we are. It seems like we're just doing a check-in on the framework. Could you give us a teaser of what you have in mind for some of the administrative guidelines, given that you know where we are strategically?
So that's a great question, Dr. Pierce. So the way I envision it is the administrative guidelines, they are technically our administrative guidelines, but it turns out to be the equity framework. So the work that I am then kind of charged to do is based on the what we have in terms of the goals and guardrails and the strategic priority areas, that's also part of the work. So as we're building the framework for the department, that becomes what the administrative guidelines are, because administrative guidelines are, in a traditional sense, can't look the same because it's an equity policy. So actually, once this is kind of approved and in the place that you all want it to be, then we can continue to move on with the work that we've already been doing, which is part of creating a framework that would undergird how this policy is enacted. So it won't be, here's administrative guidelines, 10 pages of to-dos and not to-dos. It's gonna have to look different because of all the things that we've already talked about. So I guess in terms of why we're here today, it goes back to the point that it felt as if there was still not a full ready to, at that time, to approve. And I just want to make sure as we bring this forward and it can be approved, then that begins to be our official language in terms of the definition of equity and in terms of how we create, all of what the equity work looks like. That would be what an administrative guideline would sort of be. And it would be, we would have something that would be, that you could kind of get as paper, but it begins to create that framework. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're fine. I apologize for interrupting. So it sounds to me like if we look at the guardrails that you've established related to, for example, culturally responsive teaching and the implementation of various measures around equity, that those will become the administrative guidelines for this policy. Am I hearing you correct?
Right, and because all of that it's going to be much more complex, we'll need rubrics for some things. How are we going to measure a commitment to racial equity? It won't be in a traditional guideline sort of format. We're going to have to do other work to bring that about. So that's why I want to make sure that we are clear and concise and done with in terms of how we feel about the policy, so that everything that we're creating builds off of that.
So I think, Dr. Blue, then when the committee sent the policy to you and administration, our thought process was the expectation that you all would come back with those guidelines. So it seems that at this point, we would want to see the guidelines along with your recommended revisions to the framework that the committee gave you. So once you put your guidelines in that, then you go through and make particular revisions. And if that becomes, okay, we've thought about equity more broadly, more inclusively, so we want to remove these specific categories away, then, I would venture to say that the committee is looking for that and welcomes that, right? So I think at this point, it's difficult for me I have some uneasiness saying this, but I would like to see your specific administrative guideline recommendations, the revisions that you would like to make to the framework. And your voice, your input, your expertise, your guidance on how this becomes a better policy.
Okay.
I second that.
Me too.
Okay. And then, so I guess I would only ask one quick question, which is, do you see the current, like the belief statements, is that a framework in your mind? When you think about a framework, is that what you're thinking of, Dr. Pierce?
So again, I can only speak to how the committee approached the work. And please, board members, Brown and Cole, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way we approached the work is we wanted to give those identities that we know or knew at the time were impacting student learning. And we did have to make the hard decisions to say, include this one, take this one out, deal with this one, let's not deal with that one because it's picked up in another policy. And so what I would say to you is that we've given again, a framework of what we have in an introspective way and talking to our community and understanding our student demographics at the time, saw as important. If those have changed, we definitely want your expertise to come in and just note those changes. You're the expert, right? And so let us know those changes. Submit those revisions to us. I don't think you'll get any pushback. You will get rich dialogue that will carry us, I think, to another point in developing a sound and good policy.
Okay.
Board Member Beckerly.
I kind of have two thoughts about the policy generally as it is drafted in its draft form, and also about something Jen just said, and about tying in what Dr. Pierce just said. And I think maybe to answer your question, how do we feel about these belief statements and the policy as it's currently drafted? I think, and to honor the work that's come before it to get it there, making sure that so it may be that, for example, one of the belief statements really finds its way into an action statement. So just so that, we can track it and we don't lose the thinking behind it. And it may be if it's structured a little differently, just as long as the intent is there. I think that maybe would be a rule of thumb about how to look at the next draft. And then that way we're honoring what came before and maybe taking into account what we know now. The other thing that just occurred to me, didn't just occur to me, but that Jen said that maybe is going to also should also inform how we perceive the policy in terms of how it should be structured, and that it's different from other policies, is that Jen said this is ground up work. And so I would imagine a policy that literally can't be dictated from the top down.
The policy itself, the broad vision, has to be dictated. There has to be leadership,
Right.
which we totally have. But we can't, in order for it to work, to change culture, like you can do measurement and benchmarks and you can do accountability, but to get true belief, people have to understand why it impacts them on a daily basis and in their jobs. And that you can't dictate. That's what I was trying to say.
But it also, and maybe I'm missing.
It's okay, keep going.
Yeah, no, I want to hear what your reaction to this is. And maybe for us to be intentional and mindful about the culture change we're trying to accomplish, something needs to find its way into the policy that acknowledges that. Does that make sense?
You mean like the interruption of the system?
I don't mean that
in explicit. I mean.
Well, so that's a whole. So I think that's something that in the slide that came up that maybe isn't in there. Like when we start to talk about systemic equity issues, where you started getting to, which again, think about all that we've done in this area just as a district and board in like lobbying and speaking publicly on systemic issues in education. We weren't in that same seat when we were doing that first policy. And so we know that there are systemic equity issues both outside and just the system, inside the way we process things. And that also kind of goes back to your idea around the time tax, right? That's an inequity. Some individuals, depending on their groups, have a tax on their time that's different. Why do some groups have to stand in a line for an hour while some get to just pay to get a service like that? That is, as an example, but so there's lots of different ways to kind of look at it.
Yeah.
But all of that, I guess, this work is still growing and learning, and so it is hard to capture what might be the next thing that we need.
But I was trying to think about the words from Carol. How do you ensure that the system understands that we're doing something different, right? So it's more of that. That's why I used the word interruption of the system, right? So how do we become more explicit that we're saying we are going in a different direction, and it's explicitly stated. So I think that's what you were trying to get to, in a way that what Jen said, you can't make people do it, but you can let people see that we're going in a different direction.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Right, and I think being explicit
And that was why some of those other, and this may be a little bit too, something that Dr. Pierce mentioned, but one of the reasons that I just added the sample language was just, and I'm sure obviously you all looked at that when you were looking at other districts, is just to say how strong of a statement do we want to say as a board, this is how we, I mean, we have the belief statements, but, you know, are some things, you know, more that, no, we don't necessarily want to say it that way, or is this bold enough language that we have in the policy? Because I know that the things that we're going to have to do and see in order to really reach equity are going to have to be bold, to your point, Board Member Cole. So these were just examples that obviously we don't have to discuss, but since you all have already probably seen some of this in other policies, that's the reason that I wanted to bring them up today to say, hey, is this stronger language than we may have, or is this language too strong, or is this not a direction that we would go?
You know, the other thing, this is a footnote, but I don't know that there's any organization that's really getting this right. And even if they're getting it right in policy, are they getting it right in practice? So I think we should feel free to figure out what we need to do for us.
Yeah, there's no roadmap to this. I mean,
Yeah,
every
we're making it up.
organization, every place that this is implemented will be different, and so that needs flexibility as well. I think in terms of this, I see you. I'll get you. In terms of the statement, so for me, some of those statements border on anti-racism statements, which is totally fine if that's what we want to do. For me personally, in this work, that is two separate things. Right? So an anti-racism statement, any other thing, ism, just like we did with the LGBTQIA, right? That in essence is an anti, discrimination, harassment type of a statement, right? It's different than equity. And so I think that while sometimes we will need to address, and we do need to address, because I'm the first to say we do have systemic racism in education in Columbus City schools because we're built on it. That's a little bit different of a statement than just like a bigger equity, in my opinion. Well, I think, but if we need to work on that, then Dr. Blue is the DEI expert leading this work in our district. I would need your recommendation that says, board, you know what, over the next 3 years, we're going to lean into the dimension of diversity around race. And we see that this is a problem, this is how we're going to address it. And so, under that equity lens, we're going to go ahead and move into anti-racism work, right?
As opposed to including it in the policy.
Right.
Okay, that's
Dr. Pierce, it's hard, I look up there and I see, I don't know if they go up and down, so I think they're both up.
Yes, I take it down each time
Okay.
I talk. So I just wanted to say that in terms of the intensity of the statements, Dr. Blue, I think it's really a matter of you and the team determining how those goals and guardrails align with the framework that we've brought you. And again, as President Adair is saying, it gives you the platform, the trampoline to, really focus that work in particular areas. So I would caution us in bringing this to the board to determine how strong we want the statements to be. It's really what measures do we have that will allow us to determine if the work that we are doing is making an impact. We can have statements that are very strong from day's beginning to day's end, but are not making an impact on student learning.
That is true. Very true.
Board Member Brown.
Thank you. I was, part of what I was going to say is precisely what Tina just said. I think we do, but one of the things that I think we need to look at, is how this draft, which I believe was initially created in the policy committee, was prior to this public discussion on CRT, was prior to the use of the term and discussion of what is anti-racism. And it was also before this board developed its goals and guardrails. And I think that one of the things that we'll need to do, perhaps to some extent administratively at your lead, Dr. Blue, and partly when it comes to the Policy and Governance Committee, is that we do rethink it to some extent by those changes that have occurred that we weren't aware of or thinking about at the time we first brought this together. I know that Dr. Pierce has done a lot of work on it, but I'm not sure any of us have really rethought anything subsequent to all those changes that have occurred in society and in the district. So I think that's very important that we do. I too want to see the administrative guidelines worked up, knowing on the one hand, those are administrative guidelines, not for the board, but also they will undoubtedly prompt some further discussion on the policy and make sure that we're in alignment and that there aren't any other things we want to do or do differently in the policy itself. So, thank you.
And if you all recall, this is really our first time since I've been here of having this discussion specifically about the policy. So it was a very necessary discussion because this is part of my work and I have to be able to have this discussion with you all. So I appreciate that. We've gotten a lot of great input and feedback and context creation, at least for me and my team. And so we'll kind of go from here to kind of look at the things that you've told us, come back to the committee, and just kind of go from there in terms of our next steps as a team. So and with that piece, that's kind of my final. We'll just, kind of run it through the process in the same way all the other policies are. So we'll take the next revisions into the committee.
Reverend Brown, were you trying to say something?
I'm sorry, I think I did. I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Blue for the work that she's done on this. And yeah, all of that work was done prior to her arrival in the policy committee. So it's going to look, in many ways different. The discussions are going to be different, than we're going to have Dr. Blue and her team participating with us at the policy committee. So that will all be very welcome. And I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, different doesn't mean bad. It doesn't mean that the work wasn't important. It was. We are just literally in a different time and space. And it's fair that we go back and look at it. And we now have DEI experts that are on the team, 3 of them. And so, we did the best, to create that with, expertise that we are bringing to the table, but now we have dedicated professionals to help. And so, we are excited to continue to learn from you and hear your guidance and recommendations so that we can ensure that we are truly meeting our vision of equity, which is the foundation of really all that we're doing. And so, thank you, Dr. Blue and team. Dr. Dixon, do you want to say anything?
Can I just say something really quickly? Because there's another piece to what's new. We didn't have Dr. Blue and her team before to help, and we were doing it, as Jen said, at the best of our ability and with the expertise that we had at the time. But you're also the ones that have to implement it. So your input is, we were just had an organization that was supposed to implement a policy that we were going to issue. Now we have people charged with implementing it. So that input is necessarily going to change what it looks like as well.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
President Adair, could I just add?
Yes.
I would like to thank all the committee members who worked on this policy.
Yes.
We do have a number of experts that are coming from different spaces, Ohio disabilities organizations that do this work and are professional and again, we worked really hard on it. The next thing I would like to add is understanding that Dr. Blue's schedule may not permit her to make those committee meetings. Can we have representation from someone on her team? Does it necessarily have to be Dr. Blue that attends those policy governance committee meetings?
The interesting thing is, it's our team meeting time, so we're all in that team meeting, so we'll make
Oh.
adjustments to
Yeah.
our department meeting so that
Oh,
we
good.
can have someone there.
Or could I ask my colleagues, because I teach at the same time, and it's hard for me to make.
So that
I
sounds,
mean,
that sounds
That's
like,
something to take up at that meeting.
yeah, that's a conversation to have with the policy, yeah, with the governance.
Now that you
So-
mention it.
yes.
All right, so I just want to just say thank you again to Dr. Blue and her team, and thank the board for this work. This is something we prioritized since 2019. You guys gave me a year to get a person in place, and just thank you for your work. We know this work is not easy, it's changing, but it is a priority. So it's important that we get it right. It won't be perfect, there's all the reasons that we stated, but it is about changing the system and interrupting the system so that we're focused on making sure our resources, our practices, all of those are equitable across the district for all of our students. So this is her work, and that's why she wants to ensure that we got it right, because we're going to be held accountable to make sure that this work is where it needs to be. So thank you for your time, and thank you for even for staying. Even these conversations that we're having, and we are seeing some changes already happen. It happened today in a meeting we had, Stan and I, with some team members. And we're changing the conversation. So to your point, Carol and others, the conversation has already started, and we are seeing a more equitable more equitable processes that are happening as we're making decisions in the district. So thank you for your time this evening.
Yes, thank you.
If I could, just mechanics, so you all know, we've got a committee meeting of the Governance and Policy Committee this Thursday morning. Obviously, none of this will be right for placing on the agenda this Thursday morning, but I will tell the committee that we're going to be making some changes, perhaps in the committee time or not. But we'll talk about it there and get started with figuring out a new date if that's what we should do. And I would at least let you know for now that the March meeting is currently on the books for the 10th of March. Again, 8:30 to 10 as always, but it's movable. And we should probably get at that sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Brown. Any other comments?
Just thank you.
And thank you all for your time this evening. I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll just need a motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Please call the roll. Or no, we can just adjourn, right?
You may just adjourn. Hearing no objection, you may adjourn.
Hearing no objection, we are adjourned.
I thought I had another 15 minutes.